Hello and welcome. You found the Social Work Podcast. My name's Jonathan Singer, and I'll be your host as we explore all things social work. Hey there, podcast listener. Jonathan here. It's been a little while. Well, today I got a good one for you. In today's episode of the Social Work Podcast, I speak with Carol Tosone. She's professor of social work and director of the DSW Program in clinical social work at NYU Silver's School of Social Work. Longtime listeners of the podcast will remember my interviews with Carol on shared trauma and psychoanalytic social work, and I was really excited to be able to speak with Carol for today's episode. Carol and I spoke on April 1st, 2020, about her insights into the COVID-19 pandemic, about psychotherapy and technology and shared trauma. But because of everything that was happening in the world, it's taken me nearly 5 weeks to publish the episode. And as longtime listeners of the podcast know, although 5 weeks is a quick turnaround for me, it's been an eternity in an environment where life is changing every day. Now, I was excited to speak with Carol because of her expertise in the area of shared trauma, right? This idea that when the therapist and the client go through the same traumatic event, it's not secondary trauma, it's not compassion fatigue. Folks are actually sharing a traumatic event. And I was also excited because of our interview from way back in 2009, where she talked about being with clients from a psychoanalytic perspective. And these two episodes, the shared trauma and the psychoanalytic social work, are among the most widely shared in schools of social work. So I was excited to have her back. And so in today's episode, we talk about how the concept of shared trauma can help us to understand what's going on in this global pandemic, how we can think about the role of technology-mediated services for mental health, and what social workers can do to care for themselves while caring for others. And now, without further ado, on to episode 126 of the Social Work Podcast, Shared Trauma and the COVID-19 Pandemic, an interview with Carol Tosone. Carol, thank you so much for being back on the podcast and talking with us again about trauma.
Thank you, Jonathan. My pleasure.
How does your understanding of shared trauma and your research in this area inform how you understand the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, I think with 9/11, you're going to find certainly in the media and even in the professional literature, comparisons to people's experience of 9/11 compared to COVID-19. Such that it's impacted so many people. Now, with my research in shared trauma with 9/11, I looked at Manhattan clinicians. And with Hurricane Katrina, I looked at New Orleans, primarily NOLA clinicians. So here, though, when we talk about COVID-19, we're talking about a global pandemic. So it's not restricted to one area or one group of clinicians. Everyone is being exposed. Our clients, our patients, they know that we too are going through it. They may be asking us questions about it. So there's oftentimes more of a tendency to self-disclose. So it's very different in that everybody is going through it. So it's like shared trauma on steroids, if you will. Because part of what informed my research around shared trauma was that people were using the term secondary trauma to really talk about a dual response to what they were experiencing. And here it's very much, it's the pandemic impacts everyone. Everyone knows it. Clients are asking, where are you now? They want to know where you're situated. They want to know what your situation is. And I mean, I was trained in a very traditional analytic model of which you're asking the question, why do you want to know this and that? But I think in this instance, there's a greater call for therapeutic intimacy And that's what I found in my research with both 9/11 and Hurricane Katrina. I found that clinicians during the crisis and afterwards were more inclined to be more open with their clients, to really share more of their own experience and their own reactions, and such that the clients appreciated that. And there was a kind of, the experiencing was a leveling of sorts, if you will, because both were going through it. And they appreciated the humanity of the clinician. That's really what oftentimes held them together most, and what they referred to afterwards.
And so what you found in your research was that clinicians shouldn't be afraid or dismissive of the conversation where they share about what's going on with them in this shared pandemic experience, because people already know that it's going on.
Right, exactly. So you can model for them, in a sense, the openness around what you experience, perhaps how you try to handle it. And this is a choice for each clinician. I'm not suggesting that everyone do it, but what I'm saying is, what we found in the research is that it shifted the way in which many people practice, such that they were much more comfortable with self-disclosure afterwards. They were much more comfortable practicing in a more relational model, and that the clients appreciated that as well. And I think with this current situation, if you're saying, I'm not concerned or I'm not worried, and I've had clients, ask me my experience, and if they pick up an inauthenticity to it, I'm not sure how that furthers the therapeutic work. Whereas you can model a sense of both holding some anxiety with the unknown, but also being able to be available. And the work in some ways can help us as clinicians. I mean, for us, think about it, it gives us a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning, and it's an organizing experience for us. So when I work and I'm joining in someone else's experience or anxiety around it, I can be helpful to them. And in my helping them, that helps me.
It's really interesting that you are taking this experience of anxiety and fear and unknown that the clinician is experiencing, and saying that by honoring it and being authentic, that there is a therapeutic use, which is modeling how to sit with anxiety and fear and how to honor it without getting lost in it.
Right, exactly. I mean, we oftentimes use the parent-child, comparison to therapist and client, and I think that does bear some merit. But if you think about what COVID-19 does, much more so than 9/11 or Hurricane Katrina, is the sense of isolation and loneliness. And anyone living alone, they're lacking, the physical connection to someone else. So if you think about it, the sense of isolation and the real need to connect on all kinds of levels. So I think we can really lend ourselves to that person in a way. And granted, it's through a medium that's not wholly desirable. I think many clinicians are struggling with, teletherapy, be it the technology or even feeling comfortable with it. And I mean, let's face it, there's a certain disadvantage. You can't really see, other than a talking head, you're really not getting a sense oftentimes of the body language, the anxiety that gets conveyed in other ways. So you've got to kind of intuit what is going on. So what it does is it challenges us to be able to kind of try and be more intimate through this medium. So I think everyone's on, novel ground, if you will.
Well, what you were just saying about folks being on novel ground, I think is really important, because not only are the client and the therapist experiencing the same novel coronavirus pandemic, but for many folks, the technology-mediated service is novel. And yes, therapists are on social media, they text, they FaceTime with their friends, and clients do the same thing. But for folks who have been working face to face, this is another transition. What recommendations do you have for clinicians who are transitioning to an online environment in terms of really focusing in on the therapeutic relationship, as you were just mentioning?
Well, I think for one thing is they've got to be attuned to their own anxiety around it, use every tutorial they can and everyone who's more well versed. And there's so much reverse mentoring where our kids can really tell us more about how to use the technology, if you will. People who are traditionally trained, oftentimes they value face to face and can be pretty dismissive of other types or mediums. And I think in this day and age, even pre coronavirus, the reality is there are people who are using all kinds of mediums, text, email, Zoom, all kinds of things to really communicate, and mediums that are HIPAA compliant. And I think it behooves all of us really to get up to speed with those mediums. And we have to accept the challenge. If we are living in a new time, then we have got to be able to model for our clients the ability to kind of master what this calls for. And that is, how do we communicate our caring, our concern, our availability through this medium? How do we now convey it through our voice, through simply the visuals of our face? Because this is what we are limited to right now.
So, with your insight into shared trauma and the novelty of both the pandemic and the technology, what are some tips that you have for clinicians?
Well, I think, first of all, I neglected to say before, I was talking more kind of about the challenge of, working in this new environment, but there's also wonderful benefits. You get to see the client in be it their home or their office. You oftentimes get to see pets. You get to see their favorite room to be in. You may be getting a tour of something that they want to explain in vivo that they can't convey in their office, even with sharing a picture. So you get to see in vivo their reactions to certain things that they want to share. So I think we have to keep in mind that piece of it. Now, in terms of kind of tips, the idea is we are our own instrument. So unless we're feeling good about ourselves, it's very difficult for us to really be working and helping others. And by that, I'll go to the example back to 9/11, where there were some people who they were just so overwhelmed by what was happening. They're saying, I can't function. I would love to volunteer, but I really can't. I just feel like I have to take care of mine and my own. And I think you need to know yourself, because part of it is, if you're taking care of yourself and if work helps you and helps others at the same time, it's terrific. But if you feel overwhelmed, know it. You know what I mean? Know it. And I think importantly, we have to practice what we preach. I mean, many times I suggest going out for physical exercise or using the Calm app or other things. But do I use them myself? Not as often as I'm recommending them. So I think what's so important is that we utilize the same resources that we're telling our clients to do, rather than it just be lip service. We talk about self-care, but I'm not sure that we really practice it in the way that we kind of need to. And following from that, I'm going to contradict myself, because
Okay, go for it.
in some ways, I mean, now's a perfect time. I can write that book. I can do this. I can do that. But you know something? I may not get around to it. I may be sitting around and eating Ben and Jerry's chocolate therapy ice cream and be very happy, watching, reruns of, HBO series. so that we have to be kind with ourselves at this time too. We have to be comforting of ourselves. So we have to acknowledge that we're all regressed in some way during this time. And so to be patient with ourselves and to nurture ourselves. And again, keep in mind, because of the physical isolation that many people are in, and even if you're in with your families, what's one of the things that I think is very helpful. See, everything that I think a therapist is recommending or doing for themselves, I think it all also behooves them to suggest it for their clients. And one of the things that I found tremendously useful is there are so many video and memes and everything going across, that are coming in by email, by text, by Facebook, by everything else, that are so funny. They speak the truth about how people are dealing with it, but they're so funny. And I think humor it's so instrumental right now because it connects us to kind of a mindless joy, a part of ourselves that really need that we kind of need to retreat into that. In other words, to not lose sight of the fact that even though this is happening for a long time and it's happening all over, we need to kind of keep up the things that give us joy. And there's nothing better than laughter. There's no medicine better than laughter. So one of the things I've been doing is sending around to loved ones every day, a laugh of the day.
Are there other things that you learned from your research or that you just know from your own clinical wisdom about having been through a shared trauma experience that you want to share with other clinicians?
Well, I think probably the most important thing is that the people who fared best really talked about having a sense of purpose. Many of them talked about a spiritual basis for their work. And as Viktor Frankl said, he who has a why can bear any how. And there's so much truth to that in the sense that if you feel what you do is vitally important and you hold on to that, that can carry you through this time. And I think that's important that we kind of not lose sight of why we're doing this work and how vitally needed it is, and to know our limits. For instance, around volunteering, I'm, offered to do volunteer work for the state, as many clinicians have responded to the call. But normally I'd say, yes, I'm available whenever and I'll rearrange everything else, but I know my limits. So you volunteer as much as you can and be okay saying no. So it's really kind of know yourself, have compassion for yourself around what you can and can't do, and then give wholeheartedly with everything that you can, and to know that. And I think too, I draw from, I've worked with clinicians in Afghanistan, in southern Israel, near the Gaza Strip. And I mean, I know the kinds of experiences that they have lived with and the fear of threat on a daily basis, and their desire to help and their tremendous belief in what they do keeps them going. And I think our services are going to be needed now more than ever, especially with healthcare workers, you know. So we are really needed, and I just hope that people don't lose sight of that in terms of what we have to offer.
It's really inspirational and motivating for me to think about how social workers, mental health providers can help out healthcare workers, and how necessary our services are going to be in the future. And yet, I also don't want folks to hear this and think that we're being kind of Pollyanna-ish about how intense this is. And I was wondering if you found anything in your research about how folks function when they're not feeling 100%, when they're not feeling so hopeful or like solid about the future.
Well, one of the things I looked at in the research was one of the variables I looked at was attachment styles. And so we found certainly, and not unexpectedly, is that if you were more insecurely attached, you tended to be more traumatized. But also, very importantly, is you might have been insecurely attached, you might have felt some degree of trauma, but that didn't mean you weren't effective in your work. And that's important so that somebody could work effectively, evidence resilience, because we put in a measure on that too, evidence resiliency, but also be traumatized. And I think that's so important because that's a more human picture of us. It's not just if you're securely attached, well, therefore you're going to be less traumatized and do excellent work. You can be traumatized, but you can also be resilient. And I think that really speaks to, the mental health field, be it if someone is a social worker, psychologist, psychoanalyst, psychiatrist, whatever, is that's something we have to offer. We oftentimes are the models of mastery. We might have known it in our own personal lives. And what we do is we kind of model it for our clients. And so the fact that somebody can be traumatized and resilient, I think, is so important for people to keep in mind.
Inspirational. Thank you so much. Carol, I really appreciate you talking with me today about this pandemic and about how we can learn from the research that you've done on shared trauma. And I hope that you and your loved ones are safe and healthy. And I look forward to talking with you again in the future.
Thank you, Jonathan, to you too and your family.
Thank you. I'm Jonathan Singer, and thanks for being with me today for another episode of the Social Work Podcast. If you missed an episode or have suggestions for future episodes, please visit socialworkpodcast.com. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit our online store at cafepress.com/swpodcast. To all the social workers out there, keep up the good work. We'll see you next time at the Social Work Podcast.